In Racing Through Time, we look at the drivers, the teams, the races and the circuits that made motorsport history. The story of Lotus is the story of one man, Colin Chapman. Chapman's influence on the world of motor racing was immense. His unique talent as an engineer, designer, entrepreneur and above all, enthusiast. Colin Chapman had the determination to steer Lotus from a North London backyard to World Championship success. In Racing Through Time, we speak to those who knew Colin Chapman, his wife Hazel, team drivers Cliff Allison and Innes Ireland, Betty Hill and engineer Keith Duckworth. This is the story of how the team made its first steps towards Grand Prix success. Anthony Colin Bruce Chapman was born in Richmond in Surrey on the 19th of May 1928. His father was the owner of the Orange Tree Public House and later moved to the Railway Hotel in Tottenham Lane, Hornsey, North London. Colin attended the Stationers' Company School in Hornsey. He decided on a career as an engineer. In March 1944, he was to meet the woman in his life, Hazel Williams, at a dance at the Hornsey Town Hall.
It was the first dance I'd ever been to, as a matter of fact. And it's just amazing that I happened to meet him.
Chapman enrolled at University College London in October 1945 to study engineering. He devoted his spare time to developing an interest in trading cars and motorsport.
I mean, first of all, it was a bicycle, and then it was a motorbike. Cars, he used to dabble in second-hand cars, try and make a bit of money.
Did she realise where it was going to lead?
Not until he did actually make one. In the lockup at where I lived, the back of the house where I lived with my parents. We started in trials. We didn't race immediately. First of all, we went on these mud plugging trials, which were great fun.
In 1948, Chapman graduated as a civil engineer and continued to compete in car trials. The vehicles used were similar to those used in club racing. While at university, Colin learned to fly and then joined the RAF in a short-term commission. This experience was to influence the rest of his life, owning his own plane and basing his designs on aircraft construction principles. He experimented with other types of motorsport.
Well, then we did hill climbs and sprints, still with the trials cars. And then I suppose Colin got the bug for motor racing and started designing a car specifically for motor racing.
So what started off as one car just for fun started to expand.
Well, I think we built about 3 or 4 cars first before he started selling them to other people.
The first Lotus made for sale was the Mark VI. It had a light but rigid multi-tubular space frame that would take a number of different engines and was sold as a kit of parts to avoid purchase tax.
And I bought a kit to build a Lotus Mark VI, or I bought the chassis or organised that from Lotus and went to my local friendly Ford dealer, Skippers at Burnley, and organised to get back axles and front axles and all the bits of Ford that we use in the Mark VI. And so whilst at university, in one of the summer holidays, I built a Lotus Mark VI from this kit of bits. I had the 1100 Climax was available at that time, or just becoming available, and I actually got one of the first 25 of the racing 1100 Climaxes and fitted it into this Mark VI with a MG TC gearbox. I had great delusions of grandeur as a racing driver, and as soon as I finished at university, I attempted to race my Mark 6 Lotus.
With some success?
I wouldn't have said so. I then went to Goodwood again, and it was approaching the chicane that my brakes locked and refused to unlock, and I hit the chicane, which was a mobile lump of wood at that time, with a stack of geraniums along the top. And I moved this about 6 feet along, and I ended up with a plant pot full of geraniums in my lap and a very bent car. I'd already decided, really, that there were people who could drive naturally, and another category who gained competence by experience. I decided I was firmly in that category, and that it was actually a very slowly gaining competence with experience, and that therefore I better find something else to do. And so I couldn't afford to do otherwise. So I forgot about racing and concentrated on playing about with racing cars and engines.
In October 1954, Colin and Hazel were married and bought a home near Barnet. Chapman was working long hours at 2 jobs, by day for British Aluminium and at night for Lotus.
In those days, there wasn't anything else to do, really. I mean, we didn't watch television. There were no lovely restaurants to go to. People didn't dash off abroad for summer holidays and that sort of thing. You know, just after the war, there really wasn't an awful lot for young people to do. So working filled the gap, really. He used to come home and we had a drawing desk in our home, and he used to spend most of his time at that. He was just doing what he enjoyed, designing cars.
In the early 50s, Britain didn't have a successful Grand Prix team. In sports car racing, it was a different story. Jaguar, with their C and D types, and the DB3S Aston Martin were taking on Ferrari, Maserati and Mercedes-Benz. Jaguar had already won Le Mans in 1951 and 53 and finished second in 1954. Small sports cars like MGs, HRGs and Fraser-Nashes were modified pre-war designs. Although Lotus had used Ford and MG engines, all this was to change when Coventry Climax introduced the 4-cylinder 1100cc single overhead camshaft engine. This had been developed from their successful fire pump unit. The engine was developed by Walter Hassan and Harry Mundy for Leonard Lee of Coventry Climax. Circuit racing in Britain was held mainly at Silverstone and Goodwood. Sports cars were built by established manufacturers such as MG, Triumph, Riley or Fraser-Nash, or by small manufacturers with modest premises like John and Charles Cooper at Surbiton. The alternative was to use a small lock-up garage and have a job in the day and work on the car in the evening. That was how Lotus started. Colin Chapman decided his next car, however, would be truly aerodynamic. Mike Costin, now Chapman's partner, introduced him to his brother Frank, who was an aerodynamicist with de Havilland Aircraft Company. The result was the Lotus Mark 8, 9 and 10. Chapman designed the Lotus 8 with far more ambition. He wanted a larger engine and more power, a 4-speed gearbox, hydraulic brakes and more advanced suspension, and most importantly, an aerodynamic body. Frank Costin designed the body with its twin tail fins, and it was very efficient. The Mark 8 was fitted with a bored-out MG 1250 engine, now at 1498cc and developing 98 horsepower. With the help of the slippery aerodynamic body, it was one of the most potent 1500 sports cars in the country, and it was followed by the Marks 9 and 10. The 9 was fitted with the Coventry Climax 1100cc unit, and the 10 with the MG or the Bristol unit, or even the Alta-based Connaught engine. At Le Mans in 1955, Colin Chapman began his love-hate affair with the 24-hour classic race. The entry of the 1100 Mark 9 was accepted, and it was specially prepared for the event. The races had attracted entries from many sports car manufacturers. The new MGA and the Triumph TR2s made their debut here alongside Lotus. Chapman himself and Ron Flockhart drove the car. Chapman was extremely accomplished as a driver and led his class in the early stages before experiencing difficulty with a slipping clutch. After some sand had been put on it, the car was competitive again. The early part of the race saw a tremendous battle between Hawthorne's Jaguar and Fangio's Mercedes-Benz, with the lead changing frequently. Chapman was in and among the small car competitors when the tragic accident happened for which the 1955 race is remembered. The Lotus had slid off at Arnage and was disqualified for backing out. This was not the last run-in between Lotus and the Le Mans officials. The race was won by Hawthorne and Buab for Jaguar. In the 1955 Goodwood 9-hour race, Cliff Davis and Peter Scott Russell in their Bristol-engined Mark 10s battled with Archie Scott Brown's Lister Bristol. On this occasion, the Lister had the advantage over the Mark 10. Chapman's leading 1500 blew up after 7 hours, and Cliff Davis finished a fine second in his class with the Mark 10. The TT at Dundrod in Northern Ireland in September was Lotus's best race in 1955. Chapman and new recruit Cliff Allison in the 1100 Mark 9 impressed everyone, leading the 2-litre class by 9 minutes and leading the index of performance by miles until the oil pump fractured. There were serious accidents at Dundrod which emphasised the dangers of motorsport at the time.
When you're young, you don't worry, do you, like you do as you get older. I just used to be extremely annoyed if he didn't finish the race and crash the car or something, then make a lot more work for everyone to have to rebuild it.
By now, Lotus had acquired a new employee in Graham Hill. He and Cliff Allison were to shape Lotus's future.
He was a mechanic come race driver, and he didn't have a car, so he got talking to a man called Mike Costian, who is Cosworth, and Mike said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going back to London." "How are you getting there?" "Well, I mean, can you give me a lift?" "Yeah, okay." So they got into this furniture van, and the driver just looked at this third person, and they tootled off down past Swanley, and there was a greasy spoon, so, you know, one of these terrible cafes, and Colin, and it happened to be Colin Chapman, who was the driver of this van, and he said, "Come on, we'll stop here and have something to eat." And they got talking, and Graham realised by then that it was Colin Chapman of Lotus, and he asked him for a job. Colin thought that he was Mike's friend, and Mike didn't know him any more than Colin or Graham knew. You know, they didn't know each other at all. They just happened along each other. So that was the beginning of their association with Colin and Lotus.
When Colin wanted to have a replacement works driver, he contacted Reg Tanner, who was then the competition manager for Esso, and he looked through his list of drivers who he had contracted to him on other formulas, and I was one who was on the Formula 3. And when I went down to Snetterton, Reg asked me if I would like to try a Lotus out, and I said yes, I would like to try one out. And so I went out and did a lap round the track, and at that time Peter Jopp and Ron Flockhart were the works drivers for Lotus. And I went reasonably quickly, and then I came in again, and Reg was in conversation with Colin, and they seemed quite pleased. And Reg said to me, "Do you think you could go a little bit quicker?" I said, "Oh yes, I could go quite a lot quicker, you know." He says, "Mind, don't bend it, because it's the only one we've got, you know." So I went out and went a little quicker and said thank you very much, and went on and did my own Formula 3 racing in the same day. And when I got back to Brough, way up in the frozen north, there was a contract from Lotus waiting on the table for me to drive for them. So that's how I originally joined Lotus.
Was this a proper works car, or did Cliff own it?
Well, in those days, to avoid paying purchase tax, which it was in those days, you could have one racing car each, and so we all ended up with a car each on the record, but they were all actually owned by the Team Lotus.
An indication of Chapman and Costin's growing reputation was when they were invited by the owner of Vanwall, Tony Vandervelde, to redesign the chassis and body of the Grand Prix car in 1956. The result was superbly efficient, the teardrop-shaped Vanwall, which was to go on to great things. For the French Grand Prix at Reims, Chapman was invited to drive the Vanwall and in practice was shown around by Mike Hawthorne. Braking for the Tilloy hairpin at the end of the long straight was not a simple business. Unfortunately, due to ineffective rear brakes, Chapman crashed into a concrete post, his only chance to drive in a Grand Prix. This was particularly unfortunate as he was just getting used to the car, and it was widely thought that Chapman would have made a first-rate Grand Prix driver if he'd so wished.
He was a very good driver. I quite think that had he not been more interested in the mechanical side and the cars, he would have certainly made a very good Grand Prix driver.
The Chapman-Costin modified Vanwall gave Stirling Moss and Tony Brooks their victory in the British Grand Prix at Aintree. Moss also won at Pescara in Italy and the Italian Grand Prix in 1957. In 1958, Moss battled with Mike Hawthorne's Ferrari for the World Championship. Vanwalls, driven by Moss and Brooks, won 8 World Championship Grand Prix during the year and the Constructors' Championship for the first time in 1958. Moss lost the driver's crown by just 1 point to Mike Hawthorne. Chapman was even asked by BRM to assist with their cars.
There was a period where several people asked him to drive their car that they designed in motor racing, and that rather annoyed me because I didn't think they were up to his standard of designing cars. And they expected him to drive it in a race and then redesign it for them, which I thought was a competition for us. So it would be much better if he gave that up and just concentrated on designing his own cars. But then I think he realised that it would be better if he got someone else to drive it.
1956 saw the introduction of arguably Chapman's most successful sports racing car, the Lotus 11. Designed as a replacement for the Mark IX, it featured a space frame chassis with independent front suspension and an optional de Dion rear axle covered by an aerodynamic body. The 11 would take a variety of engines from the 1100 and 1500 Coventry Climax and even the Maserati. More than 200 were built. The model was to prove one of the most successful racing cars ever made. By now, Graham Hill had progressed at Lotus, having risen from the ranks of mechanic to racing driver. Here he's seen driving an 1100 Lotus 11 and leading the field. The Lotus 11 in the hands of talented club racers was winning races all over Europe. Graham Hill wins at Alton Park, although at Le Mans he was back on the spanners as chief mechanic. Despite the fracas in 1955, Lotus entered 3 cars for 56. 2 were 1100s and 1 had the 1500 Climax engine. At the start, Stirling Moss, as usual, sped into the lead with his Aston Martin, followed by Ron Flockhart in the Ecurie Cross D-Type Jaguar. The Works Jaguar team was decimated by a crash in the S's and fuel injection problems on Hawthorne's car, leaving Flockhart and Sanderson to battle it out with Moss and Peter Collins for the lead. Meanwhile, Chapman in the 1500 car was well up with the Porsche opposition, and Cliff Allison was leading the 1100s. At dawn, the usual tricky mist settled on the surface. Allison hit a large dog which ran onto the circuit, and as a result, the car was retired, badly damaged. By the middle of the day, Chapman and Herbert Mackay Fraser's 1500 retired with big end failure. Peter Jopp and Reg Bittnell were involved in a scrap with Hugos and Bentley in the Cooper for the 1100cc class. This battle was watched by sometime Lotus drivers Hawthorne and Flockhart. The Lotus was catching the Cooper and, to everyone's surprise, overtook on the last lap to win the 1100s and make Chapman's day. Flockhart and Sanderson won the race for Jaguar, and the little Lotuses finished first and fourth in the Index of Performance. The sport's governing body had announced the introduction of Formula 2 for 1500cc cars in 1956, and Chapman decided to build the Lotus 12 to compete in this formula. Coil springs and the Chapman strut rear suspension were a feature of the car. Its main opposition was from Cooper. The Lotus 12 was front-engined, while the Cooper was rear-engined. Both cars were powered by the Coventry Climax twin-cam engine. At this time, Cooper was still using transverse leaf springs and wishbones together with their damper units. Cliff Allison is here seen reunited with the Lotus 12. We talk to another great Lotus name, Innes Ireland.
A friend of my brother came down to Goodwood once when I was racing the Brooklands Riley 9, and he saw there were Lotus 11s racing around, and that evening after the race he said, you know, why don't you... I was always trying to beat the handicapper with my little Riley, and doing quite well at it by one way or another. And he said, why don't you get, you know, a Lotus 11? And I said, well, it's, you know, I don't quite have enough money to do that. And he said, well, you know, I'll probably help you out. And so we finished up, you know, working something out. And so I went and bought a Lotus 11. And I raced that in a couple of meetings at the end of 1956. One at Goodwood, the last of their club BARC club meetings. And then I raced again at Aintree. There was a race meeting at Aintree. I was then on my way up to the Highlands to go deer stalking, and so just did the race on the way and then parked the car and left the car on its trailer somewhere and went on up to Scotland. And so that, you know, I was fairly competitive straight away on equal terms with people like Alan Stacey, who was driving for Lotus, and Keith Hall and Peter Ashdown and people. And so that really, you know, it's the first time I had a competitive car that I could drive in scratch races.
Further developed for 1957, the 11 seen here is the John Coombs car for Ron Flockhart to drive in the British Empire Trophy at Alton Park. John Eason Gibson briefs the drivers, and at the start, the race was a battle between Flockhart in the Coombs car and Chapman in his works car. Chapman spun and lost ground, while Flockhart, driving superbly, increased his lead. Try as he might, Chapman couldn't catch Flockhart and had to settle for second place. Flockhart takes the checkered flag, with Chapman coming through in second.
I'd always wanted to be a racing driver, and I was running my own business, which gradually turned round from being Rolls-Royce and Bentley orientated into tuning and preparing racing cars. And I finished up running a team of about half a dozen Lotus 11s. And I think we had a Lola and one or two other things, you know. But I was entering and preparing and transporting these cars to all the meetings. And so I was doing my own motor racing, but also making something of an income by preparing other people's cars. I was asked to drive for Team Lotus in that first year of 57, and I drove in what was then the Swedish Grand Prix in the middle of 1957, but that was a works car. And again, I drove in the 3-hour race at Spa that year, in 57. But again, it was a works car. It wasn't, and it was 1500cc as opposed to my own private car, which was 1100. So, I mean, I was asked in my very first year, halfway through it, I was asked to drive for the works.
For 1957, Chapman was determined to again win the prestigious Index of Performance at Le Mans. he persuaded Coventry Climax to build a special 750cc engine.
Yes, it was interesting was Le Mans because we won the Index of Performance, as you know, in 1957 with Keith Hall and myself, and the prize money was £4,000, of which the arrangement was that the manufacturer kept half the prize money and the drivers kept half the prize money. And so Keith and I ended up with £1,000 each, and we thought we were millionaires then.
How did Coventry Climax reduce the engine's capacity?
Instead of reducing the bore and the stroke, they decided to just reduce the stroke. So they put a very short throw crankshaft in it, and that brought it down to the 750cc with big pistons. Consequently, the gas flow was at low revs was nil, and you had to be below 7,000. There was very little power. The power started to come in at 7,000. Between 7 and 8 you had power, and the rest of it you had nothing. Well, we obviously drove it as quietly as possible, but we were watching results and getting the results of the... it was a very complicated formula for working out the index, and we kept getting feedback every time we came into the pits as to whether we should go a little quicker or a little slower. And one of the interesting things that happened in that race was that in our briefing before the race, Colin said, if you find anything's going to fall off or anything like that, he says, don't go around to the pits, you know, pull into the side, and if you can, repair it and to keep it going. And so I was going down the Mulsanne Straight, and I heard a little zing, 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 zing from the front end of the car. And there were some signalling pits at Mulsanne's corner there, and so I just got past them, and then I pulled onto the side of the road, and I lifted the bonnet, and the wheel arch, where it came down at the back, a little bit of aluminium had broken, and it flapped up, and the wheel was catching on this aluminium, and it was making this zing zing, so I just straightened up the piece of aluminium and got it back into the car and drove around again. And of course I didn't realise, but that caused them all to have kittens in the pits because they thought the car had packed in. Yes, oh yes, it was all very carefully calculated, and the Frenchmen, being what they are, they'd made the prize for the index the same as the prize for the overall winners. And because they were quite sure that the DB Panhards would win the index. And they were quite miffed when we won the index because we got all this prize money, which was superb.
1958 saw the Lotus 15 introduced, built to take larger engines, including the new Formula 2 1500 Coventry Climax unit. Fast but fragile, it was fitted with a new Lotus gearbox known as the Queer Box.
Best races I had, which got me some attention, was the 3-hour race at Clermont-Ferrand, which was a World Championship race, a 3-hour race, and with my little Lotus 11 I beat all the bloody works 3-litre Ferraris, Trintignant, Jean Joubert and the lot of them, which, you know, sort of, when Enzo Ferrari had, he said, they were beaten by who? Driving a what? You know, little Lotus 11, and beat, you know, that was an amazing, you know, because I, you know, won the thing outright.
1958 was not a good year for Lotus in sports car racing. The 15 was fast but unreliable. Hill won some smaller races, as did Roy Salvadori in the Coombs car, including the Gold Cup at Alton Park. At Le Mans, the 2-litre of Hill and Allison, although quicker than the Ferraris, lasted only 3 laps. All the Lotuses retired except the 750 car of Stacey and Dixon, which was still running at 4 o'clock in 20th place. At Monaco in '58, Chapman had been persuaded to try his hand at Grand Prix racing, following the Van Wall example.
I have a great affection for Monte Carlo, you see, and even going down there on the very, very first time, we stayed along the coast at a place called A's, and it was called the Bananery, and none of the team had any money, none of them, and the cars were coming down in furniture vans again, and we literally scrimped and scraped. I think we drove down there. We certainly didn't have enough money to fly down there. And there was Hazel Chapman and myself, and I think Cliff Allison's wife. There were 3 girls. It was a big treat for us, you see. And we stood on those pits and timed the fellows in dresses. I mean, we never thought about having to climb over pits the way we did. So there we were, sitting up there in short summer dresses, but exciting. Very, very exciting.
While the new 16 was being built, Hill and Allison drove the old Lotus 12, fitted with a 1.9 and 2.2 litre Climax engines, and they were raced until the 16 was ready.
Well, my first Formula One drive with the Lotus was in the Monte Carlo Grand Prix in 1958. I did drive in 57 in Formula 2 races with the 1.5 litre engine, but the car that I drove at Monte Carlo in 1958 had a 2.2 litre engine, and I managed to finish 6th, I think.
Graham Hill had started last and had to retire when a drive shaft broke. Allison, despite overheating problems and not having any brakes, drove a steady race. Moss and Hawthorne were involved in their private battle for the championship, but could only look on as Rob Walker's Cooper Climax won its 2nd Grand Prix in a row. Why was the Cooper better than the Lotus?
Well, I think it was probably due to the handling characteristics of the car, and possibly a little bit to the drivers, because I preferred driving on very fast circuits, and I think you'll find, if you look back in the records, that on the fast circuits the Lotus was quicker than the Cooper, and on the twisty circuits the Cooper was better. The Cooper was rear-engined, of course, in those days, and I think probably had a little bit better traction.
The Belgian Grand Prix, held at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit, was always an exciting race. Due to a mix-up at the start by the timekeepers, several cars were already overheating when the race started. Moss missed a gear and over-revved his engine, while Collins's Ferrari battled with Tony Brooks' Vanwall. Hawthorne was in 3rd place, and then Collins had to retire with overheating. Tony Brooks took over, and driving on one of his favourite circuits, he began to pull out a lead. Brooks revelled in the fast and daunting high-speed curves at Spa. Another enjoying the high-speed race was Cliff Allison.
The thing I liked going fast, you know, the faster the car went, the better. I had no fear of speed at all, and driving at Spa, which was at that time the quickest circuit used for Grand Prix racing, it was absolutely magic going around those really fast 160 mile an hour curves. It was marvellous.
Allison was driving the race of his life. He'd won his battle with the Coopers of Brabham and Salvadori and was now up to 4th, a great performance with the Lotus 12. Tony Brooks, well in the lead, exits La Source to discover that his gearbox is beginning to tighten. As he crosses the line, it goes. He couldn't have completed another lap. Mike Hawthorne comes up, his Ferrari accelerating away from La Source towards the finish, and his engine blows up. Then it's Stuart Lewis-Evans' turn in 3rd place, discovering as he takes La Source that his suspension has collapsed, but he still finished 3rd. In fourth place across the line is Cliff Allison in the Lotus.
One more lap and I would have won it, yes. Because all the others that were ahead of me had terminal trouble.
For the French Grand Prix at Reims, Chapman introduced the Van Wall lookalike Lotus 16. The space frame chassis was again front-engined, powered by the 2.2-litre Coventry Climax. The Lotus quadrant gearbox proved difficult to keep operational. Keith Duckworth had joined the company to try and sort out problems with the gearbox, which he did by introducing a motorcycle-style positive stop mechanism, which today would be called sequential shift. Colin Chapman's strut suspension was used front and rear. The Ferrari Dino, though front-engined with plenty of power, was too heavy and had poor road holding. And while the BRM was perhaps one of the best front-engined cars, it was never properly developed. So, how did the Cooper maintain its advantage over Lotus?
I've been asked this question before, and I was quite convinced in my own mind at that stage that Colin would certainly produce a World Championship car. The only snag that I could see was that pieces kept falling off the car, and I figured that it was only a matter of time before something vital fell off, and I fell off with it. The big joke at the time was that if you could have got Chapman to design the car and John Cooper to build it, then you would have ended up with a world beater. Well, in those days, Colin said quite openly, the easiest way to find out if a thing was the right strength was to build it too weak. And if it broke, then you built it a little bit stronger. But if you started off by building it very strong, you never knew how far you could go in lightening it. And so it was all very fine for him. He probably found out very quickly where the weak spots were, but with rather detrimental effects as far as drivers were concerned.
The 16 made its British debut at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, driven by Graham Hill and Alan Stacey. Cliff Allison preferred to drive one of the older 12s. Hawthorne and Collins continued their battle with Moss and the Van Wall for the World Championship. Cooper was becoming more competitive, with Salvadori on the front row. On the first lap, Collins forced his way into the lead, followed by Moss and Hawthorne, while the little Lotus of Hill was well placed in the midfield. Hill and Brabham had a tremendous battle, swapping places regularly. As the field passed the pits, however, Hill came in to retire. The gearbox was somewhat worn, and so was Hill's seat. Next, it was the turn of the gifted Alan Stacey, having his first Grand Prix drive. He too became a retirement with overheating. This amazing man drove in Grand Prix racing with one leg, which many people didn't realise. Then it was Allison's turn, who came in with no oil pressure. While a BRM is pushed away, Chapman in the red shirt confers with his drivers. Out on the track, Hawthorne is in second place. Collins comes through to win the race, while the teams plan the next event at the Nürburgring.
We all entered into the spirit of things, but Graham Hill was quite a practical joker, and Lewis Evans and Harry Schell, Mike Hawthorne. Unfortunately, I was just, while I was hesitating a bit there, I was just realising I was telling you all the ones that had unfortunately left us. Peter got killed, and Mike, he didn't drive round to the pits. He drove it off the road, and the report was that the clutch had gone, but it was Mike's clutch that had gone.
Peter Collins' accident cast a pall over that season.
Well, it was terrible, that, because we were all great pals, you see. Nowadays, it's the thing that surprised me particularly was I went to Monte Carlo, and at the time when Prost and Mansell were driving for Ferrari, and there was a vast tent, and in one corner there was Mansell with his little clan round him, and in the other corner there was Prost with his little clan round him, and they were obviously not on friendly terms anyway. I doubt if they were even on speaking terms, and that was quite contrary to anything I'd experienced when I was racing, because we used to all join in, have a party all together, you know, whether you drove for Cooper or Lotus or anything, you know, it was great.
At the end of the year, Cliff Allison made a decision to move on from Lotus.
As I previously stated, I thought something was going to fall off that was going to kill me.
From Lotus to Ferrari must have been a culture shock.
It was absolutely marvellous, and Ferrari in those days was quite a dictator, and what he said was law, you know, and I think as long as you appreciated that and did as you were told, as it were, then you got on all right with him. And fortunately, I never had any problems with Ferrari. A lot of drivers have complained that they did have problems, but I didn't. Well, I always had a very good relationship with Colin, and it was when I went back racing again after I'd been to Ferrari, I met Colin at Silverstone, and he said he only wished that he could have produced a more competitive car when I was driving for him in the 57 and 8 years, because he appreciated that had I had a better car, I'd have had a lot more success. There's one thing to remember, of course. I don't think there's a Grand Prix car running today that doesn't have something on that Chapman brought out first.
By this time, the Lotus 6 had been discontinued, and its loss was keenly felt by club racers with limited funds. Chapman set to work on its successor, the Lotus 7. Built with a club racer in mind, the basic design was displayed at the 1957 London Motor Show. Originally fitted with either the Coventry Climax or the Ford engine, some even had the twin-cam 1500 Climax and were known as the Super 7. In 1973, Lotus decided to stop making the 7, and they sold the design to Graham Nern of Caterham Car Sales, who had provided them with many sales of the car. These cars today are little changed from the original Chapman design, and they form one of the most successful and competitive single-make race series in the world. The versatility of the design means that the cars can even take V8 engines. And that this basic design is still popular is a testament to Colin Chapman's vision. Back to Grand Prix racing, and at Monaco in 1959, the new 2.5-litre engines were used. The extra power and torque were giving problems with the gearbox again for Cooper and Lotus. Lotus entered Hill and the American Pete Lovely in Lotus 16s, and they both started from the back of the grid. The 16 in 1959 continued to be unreliable. Sterling Moss proved to be the quickest in the Rob Walker Cooper, followed by Jack Brabham in the Works car. When Moss retired with gearbox problems, Jack Brabham went into the lead, followed by Tony Brooks in the Ferrari. This was to be Brabham's first Grand Prix victory, while Lotus still wrestled with their gearbox problem. Innes Ireland joined Team Lotus in the middle of 1959 at the Dutch Grand Prix.
My very first Grand Prix was Zandvoort in 1959 with Team Lotus, and I managed to finish fourth, which I was quite pleased about, but that was in the year when Lotuses were so very, very fragile. It was very satisfying. I'd had a good old ding-dong with Bera, and you know, he was faster on the straight, and you know, if I'd follow him closely for too long, all my temperatures started going up, so then I'd have to drop back and let it you know, cool off a bit. And also I've got all this you know, the exhaust fumes I never forget, you know, all these exhaust fumes, you know, from this Ferrari blasting out its V12 smoke at me, you know. But finally, Bera made a little bit of a mistake at one of the little corners behind the pits there. And so I managed to slip inside him, and from then on, you know, I could make enough along the back, all through the corners, and he was never able to get back past me on the straight again. So it was very satisfying to win that, or to take that fourth place. Well, I was so much a new boy, and knowing that Graham had worked at Lotus, you know, when he was working on gearboxes and things, before he actually started driving for them, I just took whatever he said as being gospel, and of course I was highly chuffed to be there anyway. I mean, I thought it was, you know, it was like Christmas has come again.
At the end of 1959, there was nothing to choose between the practice times and race results of Graham Hill and Innes Ireland. Graham left Lotus at the end of the season to join BRM. Why?
Oh, purely and simply because the cars were so fragile and they kept breaking down. I hadn't done the full season, having only started at Zandvoort, which was after Monte Carlo, and I think I finished up with more points than Graham at the end of '59. The cars were desperately fragile, and Graham had just had enough of it, and he'd been offered a very good drive at BRM, and to my mind, quite rightly took it. I mean, in '59, I ran out of brakes 4 times, and I don't mean they didn't work very well. I mean, I had none. Like the main oil line had sheared, you know, so the oil, you know, when you put your foot on the floor, the oil just went squirting out into the atmosphere, things like that. I mean, Colin's idea of a Grand Prix car was it should win the race, and as it crossed the finishing line, it should collapse in a heap of bits. If it didn't do that, it was built too strongly. I mean, that's very vaguely how Colin thought of a Grand Prix car. But sadly, you know, invariably they fell to bits before they got to the line. I don't actually think any of the problems I had with Lotus actually affected my driving, because that may mean that I'm intensely thick. I don't know, but I always felt that as long as you knew and understood what the problem had been, then it shouldn't have any effect on you. It was the unknown, you know, something that you didn't understand, which would be likely to leave you with a doubt in your mind. And I can remember Maston Gregory saying, look, you ought to get out of Lotus, but, you know, because, you know, Colin will kill you. But I couldn't see that, of course, and Colin was the one who'd given me my chance in Grand Prix racing. And of course I'd driven Lotus 11s and Formula 2 in the year before, and so I stuck to Colin Chapman. And of course, from being a very much a new boy, all of a sudden for 1960 I was #1.
From these troubled beginnings, Lotus achieved success with Stirling Moss winning their first Grand Prix at Monaco in 1960 for Rob Walker's team. Innes Ireland won Team Lotus's first Grand Prix, the US, in 1961. His reward was to be sacked and replaced with Jim Clark. The Scot went on to win the 1963 and 65 World Championships and the Indianapolis 500 in 1965. Colin Chapman introduced the monocoque Lotus 25 and in 1967 the Lotus 49 with Ford's DFV engine. Jim Clark died in 1968 and Graham Hill, who had returned in '67, won the World Championship. Jochen Rindt won the 1970 title but lost his life in the process. And Emerson Fittipaldi won in 1972. The final World Championship was with another Chapman-led revolution, ground effect. Mario Andretti led home his teammate Ronnie Peterson in 1978. On On the sports car side, Lotus became a major manufacturer, pioneering fiberglass construction. From the Lotus Elite, followed by the Elan, the Europa, and into the 1970s with the Eclat, Excel, and the long-running Esprit. Lotus ownership has transferred through many hands over the years and is now controlled by Malaysia's Proton company. The Elise is more popular than ever, and the 7, as made by Caterham with other replicas, have a wide market. Consulting work became a major part of the Lotus business. Colin Chapman died in December 1982. The Grand Prix team soldiered on, taking its last win with Ayrton Senna in 1987 at Detroit, before closing down in 1994. While the Grand Prix team has gone, the Lotus name lives on with sporty road cars and a heritage of revolutionary racing cars that all raced through time.